Well, good afternoon and welcome to our dining room and, well, sort of library in Bromley Common. We're a bit late today putting this up because sometimes life throws us curveballs. And so today we're going to look at someone whose life was thrown curveballs and yet he remained faithful. Yesterday we celebrated St. David with our Welsh cakes, cowl and daffodils. And today we're going to be looking at another Celtic saint, Saint Chad. Who, you might say? It's funny, we don't know many of the other Celtic saints, but he lived about the same time as David. Chad was one of four brothers, and between them, they were responsible for bringing the Christian message from Lindisfarne all the way down as far as Essex during the time of the early Anglo-Saxons. And he lived through very difficult times. He was around during the time of the Synod of Whitby in 664. The Synod of Whitby is very important because until then, the church in Britain was very much as it had been during the time of the Romans. Yes, we had Christianity here in Britain during the Roman occupation. But because we were so far away from Rome and most of the Romans had left us, Christianity developed in a different way here. At the Synod of Whitby, there was to be a trying to bring the two together, the Celtic Church and the Church of Rome. Ultimately, the Church of Rome held sway, and so the whole church had to adopt different traditions. Some of those traditions were very different. The Celtic Church and the Roman Church celebrated Easter on different days, different weeks. In the Celtic Church, the abbot of a monastery was one amongst equals. There was no hierarchy. Unlike the Church of Rome, where everything was based on hierarchy and pomp and ceremony. And Chad was a person who was stuck in between both the Celtic Church and the Roman Church. At the same time, in around about 664, there was a massive plague that hit Britain. Scholars think it might have been smallpox. But whole communities were completely decimated. Now, Chad had been trained under Aidan in Holy Island at Lindisfarne and became a priest, and gradually rose up and became a bishop. He was appointed by 3 other Celtic bishops, and that's an important thing to remember. When he was going for his consecration, it took him ages to travel from up north down to Winchester because so many communities were suffering from the plague. So he spent his time comforting the sick, the grieving, helping to bury the dead, giving hope, and galvanizing the churches around to work together. In many ways, he seems a man for our times, a man who was living through plague. He spent, rather than going inside buildings to sleep, he slept out in the open. They didn't know much about, viruses and disease control, but they knew enough to know that fresh air was good for you. So Chad had become a bishop. But in amongst all this, sorry, I'm moving my notes down the page. In amongst all this, the Pope appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, Theodore. Well, Theodore had decided that he was going to come and make sure that the British Church towed the line. And because Chad had been ordained by 3 Celtic bishops and no bishops from Rome, Theodore stripped Chad of all his rights to be a bishop or even to be a priest. You know, what a curveball. If you feel called by God to a ministry and then have that ministry taken away from you by someone who has just arrived and doesn't even know you. But Chad was incredibly humble and just said, okay, if that's the way you want it. But he quietly carried on looking after the sick, burying the dead, encouraging the scattered Christians to coalesce and set up preaching places and new monasteries. He was working really hard to get things done. Eventually, Theodore demanded a meeting, and he demanded that Chad arrive by horse. Chad was not given to riding horses. It was too pretentious, too ostentatious. He preferred to walk. When Theodore finally met Chad, he was so impressed by Chad's humility, his care, his real passion for the gospel, that Theodore gathered 3 other bishops from over in Europe and consecrated Chad as a deacon, and then as a priest, and finally as a bishop. So Chad was reinstated as a bishop. He became the Bishop of Lichfield, but his humility and his service is what is remembered. He was humble. Just moving my notes down a little bit more. As we look at Chad and how he worked through the pandemic of his time, we can perhaps gain some courage. What can we do as a church? How are we as church going to gather and coalesce and encourage and rebuild after the pandemic is over and we're allowed to meet face to face? Chad had a vision, but one of the things that he always said, from what I can read, was that God cared. Nothing can separate us from the love of God, not even death. Chad himself died of plague, but before he died, he is said to have welcomed death as a friend because nothing could separate him from the love of God. So there we go, another Celtic saint. Go and be blessed. And when life gives you curveballs and things don't quite pan out as you think, remember God has it all in hand. God's love is before us, God is behind us, around us, and his peace will be with us today and forever. So be blessed, and we will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.